tonight, wait tonight. Bets are off, I'm gonna find my way tonight, wait tonight. Won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your sorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make a new tomorrow. Won't you talk to me? What makes this happy faster? Showing off, don't wanna have to wait tonight, wait tonight. Bets are off, I'm gonna find my way tonight, wait tonight. Won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your sorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make a new tomorrow. Won't you talk to me? What makes this happy faster? Showing off, don't wanna have to wait tonight, wait tonight. Bets are off, I'm gonna find my way tonight, wait tonight. Won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your sorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make a new tomorrow. Won't you talk to me? What makes this happy faster?
All right. Hello, everyone. Here we are. Running a little bit late tonight, but hey, that's life. Life happens when you're making other plans. Isn't that the saying? When you're busy making other plans. So, here we are. We are starting in on um, chapter 10, which is also part 3 of the book. So, we'll jump into that. I will have to put on my spectacles here. But yeah, let me make sure everything is looking good. Yeah, everything looks good. There we go. Ugh. Oy. It's been a long day. All right. let's just jump straight on into it, shall we? I don't remember how long this chapter is. I think I looked last time, but I think it was like pretty average, like 30 pages. Anyway, let's just go and we'll read it until we're done, huh? All right, so part 10 on the problem of slavery in Western culture. David Bryan Davis, 1967, Pulitzer Prize. All right. Religious sources of anti-slavery thought, Quakers, and the sectarian tradition. Quote, I never read in history of the Waldenses, our first reformers from Popery, that they kept any slaves, end quote. Thus wrote the Quaker Benjamin Lay, who was determined in 1736 to prove that anti-slavery was the crucial test of religious purity. For according to this quote-unquote irrepressible prophet, as Whittier called him, quote, as God gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believed in him might have everlasting life, so the devil gave his only begotten child, the merchandise of slaves and souls of men, that whosoever believes and trades in it might have everlasting damnation. End quote. Slavery, in Lay's eyes, was not only a quote-unquote hellish practice, but a quote-unquote filthy sin, the capital sin, indeed. Wow, bunches of quotes. The greatest sin in the world, of the very nature of hell itself, and is the belly of hell. End quote. It was Baal and Sodom and the black dragon all rolled into one putrid mass of evil. Quote, the very worst part of the old whore's merchandise, nasty, filthy whores of whore of whores, Babylon's bastards, end quote. As this violent language suggests, the key to the religious origins of anti-slavery thought is the idea of sin. There were profound egalitarian implications in the Christian belief that God, being no respecter of persons, might give his blessings to the lowliest servant. Yet it was also a traditional belief that total subordination was man's nature and legal condition after the fall of Adam. If the absolute sovereignty of God stood behind all legitimate power, the completeness of creation as well as divine justice demanded an absolute subjection, in a spiritual sense, of all Christians. In a worldly sense, of the lowest ranks on the social scale, the essence of both sin and slavery was a denial and self-sovereignty, a denial of sovereignty, a negation of the natural ability to will that which was just and lawful. All men were condemned by Adam's sin to sweat for their bread, and some men, as Jean-Baptiste de Tertre observed, were required to sweat more than others. Sin and the necessities of providence qualified the belief in the quality of men before God, and sanctioned the enslavement and transportation to America of millions of Africans. Not true. Uh, Man's debt to God, like more worldly debts, could be put to productive use. Since sin was traditionally thought of as a kind of slavery, and external bondage was justified as a product of slavery, of sin, any change in the meaning of sin would be likely to affect attitudes toward slavery. This is not to say that men who rejected the dogma of original sin would perforce be abolitionists, or that abolitionists could not believe in man's depravity. The point is that men could not fully perceive the moral contradictions of slavery until a major religious transformation had changed their ideas of sin and spiritual freedom. They would not feel it a duty to combat slavery as a positive evil until its existence seemed to threaten the moral security provided by a system of values that harmonized individual desires with socially defined goals and sanctions. We may recall that the Essenes were supposed to have repudiated slaveholding along with other worldly compromises that prevented the soul from achieving perfection. They not only sought to escape from sin by withdrawing to a primitivist refuge, but attempted, in the expectation of an apocalyptic judgment, to realize the social meaning of moral freedom. It would be a gross oversimplification to categorize such a response to sin and salvation as Hebraic, as opposed to a Hellenistic disengagement and elevation of the soul, and to a Roman reliance on the institutional mediation of the church. But the fact remains that the Hebraic tradition of prophecy, millennialism, and deliverance from bondage gave a temporal and social dimension to man's struggle with sin. Insofar as his tradition was incorporated by the early Christian church, it profoundly altered the meaning of slavery. Some Christian masters felt it a duty to manumit their bondsmen. Some former bondsmen rose to high ecclesiastical positions, and servitude itself was expected to disappear with the imminent coming of the millennium, when creation would be restored to its pristine state. In time, however, the biblical prophecies were interpreted as allegories. Origen described the kingdom of God as a spiritual event in the individual soul, and Augustine helped to channel men's hopes and aspirations away from millennial expectation and toward the church as an extension of the incarnation. The bondsman might be liberated from the sins of the flesh, but he could not look forward to a moment in history when cruel masters would tremble and slaves rejoice as the Lord appeared against a flaming sky. Yet Christianity continued to embody a latent egalitarianism that was linked with dreams of prophetic fulfillment and freedom from the necessities of sin. Sometimes the impulse was sublimated in the form of monastic or missionary activity, or in movements for purification and ascetic reform. Sometimes it erupted in the frenzied efforts of perfectionist sects to purge themselves of sin. The relation of these sects to the moderate reform movements within the church was roughly analogous to the relation of later abolitionists to groups working for the Christianization and amelioration of slavery. But while the first uncompromising attacks on Negro slavery came from men who were heirs of the sectarian and perfectionist traditions, the relevance of these traditions to anti-slavery is not to be found in a direct transmission of ideas. Even if one could show that Gnostics, Albigensians, Waldensians, Hussites, Taborites, Ranters, and Quakers were part of a continuous development, we must recognize that such groups were concerned with their own freedom from sin and not with the freedom of slaves. Okay. The relation of the sectarian tradition to anti-slavery thought goes deeper than a simple transmission of ideas. If we are to understand the frame of mind of a Benjamin Lay, or the religious tensions which led a small number of Quakers to see slavery as the very epitome of sin, when the institution has been condoned by the dominant religions and philosophies of the West, we must first look briefly at the aspirations and behavior of certain sectarians who had no contact with the institution of slavery. For the history of sects shows that the doctrine of original sin, which had proved to be a powerful instrument in social control, was the center of severe and continuing constraints in the value systems of Western culture. By picturing God as a revolutionary, transforming force rather than a fixed good to which man aspires, some of the sectarians undermined the ideology which rationalized the existing social order as a necessary compromise with sin. In so doing, they anticipated the patterns of thought and action of the more extreme abolitionists, as well as of other secular reformers and revolutionaries who would measure human institutions against moral absolutes. The main point, then, is that the religious and philosophical compromises which had been used to justify slavery for 2,000 years also shaped a mode of protest that would ultimately appear in the abolitionist movements. Even the more radical sects differed in their views on the necessity of violence and the time and nature of the millennium. Some of the sectarian movements were the products of social or economic dislocations and embodied the concrete grievances of oppressed groups. Some leaders, like Thomas Müntzer, seized upon Chiliasm after a period of religious skepticism and uncertainty. The image of an imminent kingdom of God could revive an expiring faith and give new meaning to doctrines that had become overly abstract and irrelevant to the lives of ordinary men. But here we must disregard questions of origin and emphasis and confine our attention to general traits and tendencies associated with the sectarian's assault on sin. It, excuse me. Okay, sound good. Okay. Inspired by the apocalyptic fantasies of Hellenistic Judaism, especially the Sibylline and Johannine prophecies, the millennial sect discovered that history might replace the rituals and sacraments of the church as man's hope for salvation. This dramatic shift in the meaning of history foreshadowed the transition in 18th century secular thought from the idea of nature as a fixed and complete chain of being to the idea of history as a creative process leading to perfection. To Joachim of Fiore, a 12th century Calabrian abbot, was attributed an eschatology that exerted continuing influence on European thought. For an epoch of slave like submission to an authoritarian god, man had progressed man had progressed to a second age of filial obedience to Christ, a relationship resembling the Christian ideal of servitude. In the third age, which was near at hand, there would be neither servitude nor institutional authority. Emancipated from sin and presided over by the Holy Spirit, men might live as brothers in absolute freedom and love without need of restraint. Such an ideal of the world was a new Eden fulfilled the projected wishes of most millenarians. But if the central turning point of history lay in the immediate future rather than in a distant past, it followed that the laws and principles of the existing social order did not have prescriptive sanction and could not be associated with the immutable structure of nature. The ideals of absolute liberty, equality, and brotherhood, which the ancients had confined to a lost golden age, and which Christians had relegated to the realm of spirit, acquired destructive power when fused with a changed perception of time. Some millenarians had sufficient faith in the rightness of the social order to imagine that perfection would arrive through gradual transformation and that a direct confrontation of the worldly and divine would come only at the distant terminus of history, but others expected an explosive contest between the powers of light and darkness, a violent purging of sin and error, and a final triumph of freedom and goodness. Possibly the millenarian indulged in fantasies of persecution and suffering in order to justify his ultimate victory over original sin and social restraint. That sounds a little familiar. It has been said that masochists achieve a forbidden pleasure by anticipating and controlling the punishment that expiates their guilt. When sectarians went out of their way to provoke the wrath of secular and ecclesiastical authorities, they may have wished to bring on the inevitable retribution and to release a powerful tension generated by a new vision of time and salvation. But actual conflict between religious groups undoubtedly nourished desires for revenge and intensified the violence of apocalyptic imagery. Millennialism and a strong appeal to early Protestants who, facing the awesome might of the church, sought reassurance in the design of history, Such men saw the Pope as Antichrist and the Reformation as the fulfillment of prophecy. But defeat might also show that the last days had arrived and that goodness could triumph only by annihilating the world. History could lead to both exultation and despair. Traditionally, sin had been identified with the individual's desires and impulses which society repressed in the supposed interests of peace and harmony. Thus, even John Wycliffe had agreed with Augustine that bondage to sin was the only servitude that mattered, and that physical slavery, being a consequence of sin, was of no concern to the elect. But a changed view of history made it possible to identify virtue that man's deepest desires with man's deepest desires, and sin with the inhibiting and repressive forces blocking the path to the millennium. Instead of thinking of sin as a principle of corruption diffused through nature and transmitted by generation, the millenarian hypostasized it in the person of Antichrist, who represented significantly an absolute power and sovereignty. In the eyes of the more radical millenarians, the universe was suddenly transformed from a fixed hierarchy of moral gradations into an irreconcilable division of evil and righteousness, of darkness and light, of freedom and slavery. Insofar as all Protestants rebelled against the Church as a symbol of temporal authority which kept men's souls in bondage, they shared in the transvaluation of values which dethroned and the collective superego. But unlike the radical sectarians, the great reformers knew that a dethroned authority must be replaced, and they never doubted that the roots of sin lay in man's nature, which could never be purified by history. For Thomas Müntzer, on the other hand, the great moment had arrived when, inspired by the Holy Spirit, man could liberate himself from sin, annihilate evil, and establish the kingdom of God. The time had come when all human institutions could be judged by the absolute law of God. Men like Luther, who made compromises with human authority on the ground that sinners required restraint, were in fact surrendering to sin. According to Müntzer, all masters and princes had lost their rights of dominion. All servants were released from their obligations. Confident that symbolic acts of violence would break the binding cords of an evil society and release the pent-up forces of righteousness, this John Brown of the Peasants' War led raiding parties to destroy monasteries and convents. Other radical Chiliists attempted at times to fulfill apocalyptic fantasies by slaughtering the children of darkness. Such outward aggression was balanced, however, by a kind of social masochism that took the forms of mutual flagellation or of demonstrative acts that invited persecution. Freedom from the bondage to sin could not be won without suffering. When hard pressed, the millenarian summoned the wrathful God of the Old Testament to judge and punish his enemies. But millennialism was often combined with a kind of perfectionism which substituted a compassionate and forgiving spirit for the image of the deity as an avenging master. The Holy Spirit has been associated historically with a universal power of love which dissolves human forms and distinctions. For the mystic, union with the divine spirit is so subjective and intensely personal that the restraints of the external world lose all significance. The perfectionist sect drew upon the mystic tradition with its emphasis on direct experience as an opening of the soul to a ravishing power and on the cultivation of potential divinity within man. They were primarily concerned, however, with the social consequences of moral freedom. The adepts of the free spirit, for example, claimed that when men had been liberated from the dominion of sin, he was morally sovereign and could do no wrong. Since the principle of divine authority had been introjected within the saint's personality, every act he committed was a sacrament. The Holy Spirit wiped out all human distinctions of law, status, and morality. However, where did I get however? Between the divine and the worldly, there were no gradations, no compromises, and no agents of mediation. The bondage of sin was abolished immediately and totally, or not at all. In attempts to affirm his moral freedom, his independence from worldly standards and conventions, the perfectionist resembled the ancient cynics who considered all other men slaves. The English ranter Lawrence Clarkson maintained that no man was truly emancipated from sin until he could commit adultery without a twinge of conscience. Various sects tried to demonstrate their moral kinship with Adam by symbolically stripping off their clothes in a secluded Eden or by encouraging sexual promiscuity within the brotherhood. Occasional repudiations of monogamous marriage were only the extreme expression of a more widespread tendency to place men and women on an equal footing. For if sin, as the ranters claimed, was not a reality but only a name that could be made meaningless by an act of will, there could be no justification for inequalities of sex and property which violated the law of spontaneous love. The Munster Anabaptists made the immediate surrender of personal property a test of faith. No man, they said, had a right to live off the toil of others. Hoo, 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 hoo. Got the yawns tonight, sorry. Okay. When changing social and economic conditions brought a convergence of millennialism, perfectionism, and primitivism, the entire social order was seen to be based on a principle of slavery. There is a wide difference, of course, between identifying sin with a single institution and with the entire social order. But in their faith in man's will and the power of love, in their hostility to all compromise and rationalization, and in their determination to wage unremitting war against the forces of darkness, the radical sectarians were, in a sense, the first abolitionists. By affirming man's freedom to overcome all restraints and dominion, and by shifting the focus of fundamental value from external authority to internal impulse, they pointed the way to both reform and revolution. Later abolitionists would frequently fall into the role and pattern of thought of the radical sectarians, and occasionally they would find it impossible to contain their social protest within a narrow channel. An attack on slavery could easily develop into a challenge to law, government, and institution restraints of every kind. During the civil wars of the mid-17th century, British Protestantism fluctuated between spasms of uncertainty and ecstatic moments, when truth and holiness seemed to have been found at last. Once the fabric of political and ecclesiastical authority began to unravel, men's aspirations were left without guides or limits. The horror of the more orthodox Presbyterians and Independents, the war spawned a host of gangrena, whose millennial prophecies were coupled with defiance of the law and demands for political and agrarian reform. For these sectarians, the essence of religion was a rapturous experience that had nothing to do with creeds, churches, or covenants. In a searing flash, the divine spirit annihilated man's sinful nature, his creaturehood, and freed him from obligations to the external law. The fundamental question was whether this rebirth required violent action to institute a social order harmonious with the law of love, or a gathering of the saints and a separation from sinful society. One road would lead to martyrdom, the other to sterility and gradual extinction. Of the multitude of sects that arose during the Civil Wars, only the Quakers found a way of meeting this dilemma. That the Society of Friends was able to preserve and perpetuate sectarian ideals had an important bearing on the origins of anti slavery thought. But even more significant was the particular way in which Quakers sublimated their radical impulse to perfection and reconciled the absolute law of love with the realities of life. This gift for pragmatic adjustment not only guaranteed survival, but served to direct moral energies toward concrete objectives instead of diffusing them in a general attack upon the social order. Real quick, I'm going to see how long this chapter is. We've got a ways to go, I know, but I just want to have an idea in my head because I do have the yawns tonight, which means I'm probably going to have to get up and stand up to finish reading this at some point. Not right now, but yumpin' yoizits. Yeah. All right. So from the point we're at right now, we've got 32 pages to go. Whew. Okay. The original Quaker leaders had no intention of founding another sect or church. Their society, as Rufus Jones has written, was, quote, a little visible part of the whole family of God, a tiny fragment of the invisible church. It had no constitution, no creed, no sacraments, no clergy, no ordained officials, no infallibilities, except the infallibility of the guiding spirit, end quote. As missionaries carried the message of George Fox to the Turks, the Vatican, and the Massachusetts Puritans, they expected to emancipate men from enslaving creeds and institutions and to unite them in Christian fellowship. The universality of the Quaker mission was complemented by the radical effects of personal regeneration. When a man assented to a mystical union with Christ, his soul received a divine seed which brought rebirth, freedom from sin, and a resurrection of the inward image of God. And while the religious drama was enacted within the interior of the human soul, the external world caught its shadowy reflections. Quaker converts demonstrated their spiritual liberty by refusing to pay tithes, to take oaths before magistrates, or to bow or doff their hats to superiors. Sometimes servants and apprentices denounced the impiety of their masters. A few Quaker enthusiasts paraded naked in the streets. George Fox, who considered himself as sinless as Adam before the fall, was unsparing in his attacks on the quote unquote hireling ministry. James Naylor, his schismatic follower, claimed to be Christ manifest. If the Society of Friends had been unable to discipline this impulse toward personal perfection and social regeneration, they would doubtless have been destroyed by internal disunity, if not by persecution. Whew. It is not to account for the Quakers' self-discipline and capacity for compromise. George Fox was remarkably successful in converting men of unusual ability and experience, as well as entire groups such as the Westmoreland Seekers, who had already acquired a tradition of biblical scholarship, techniques or organization, and methods of accommodating themselves to an unrighteous society. The principle of non-resistance was itself an effective agent of social order. It differentiated Friends from some radical groups such as the Fifth Monarchy Men. It precluded violent attempts to transform the basic structure of society, and it united men in the sense of purity that comes from mutual renunciation and suffering. Robert Barclay, who systematized Quaker theology, by no means agreed with the Ranters and Anabaptists, who held that sin was but a name and that man was free to build an egalitarian utopia. Berkeley did place the inward testimony of the spirit above the authority of Scripture, reason, or external law, and thus tended to undermine the traditional foundations of social discipline. He maintained, furthermore, that Adam's sin could not be imputed to newborn infants, but if sin was supposedly the result of voluntary choice, it was not the less it was not the less inevitable. It was as if the child of bondsmen, though not inheriting the punishment of his parents, became legally enslaved as soon as he acted within the narrow limits of his condition. By nature, man possessed no ability for righteous action until his soul was quote unquote disjoined from the evil seed and united with the divine light. He could not escape from sin. While Berkeley emphasized the importance of personal responsibility, he did not challenge the traditional view of a corrupt world requiring discipline and authority. Sorry. Okay. The magistrate, to be sure, had no right or power to force men's consciences, for as well might he, quote, seek to wash the black more white, end quote. But liberty of conscience could not be extended to, quote, such wild notions, end quote, as those of the Munster Anabaptists, who would, quote, seek to make all things common, and would force their neighbors to share their estates with them, end quote. If the Quakers' personal ethics were close to Anabaptism, their views on property and government resembled those of the English Puritans. It was the Quaker genius, then, to achieve a dynamic balance between the impulse to perfection and a way of life tending to crystallize the impulse in forms that could meet the demands of reality. Expectations of both individual perfection and social regeneration shrank markedly when, well before the end of the 17th century, Quakers accepted their position as a minor sect and assumed a posture of detachment and circumspection. As Friends came to confine their demonstrative protests to such questions as oaths, tithes, and bearing arms, and otherwise adjusted themselves to the institutions of society, they developed their own distinctive psychology, a state of mind acutely sensitized to the dangers of both fanaticism and worldly compromise. This internal watchfulness was reinforced by a growing sense of their own peculiarity, a common memory of persecution, and an inclination to separate themselves as far as possible from an unfriendly world. But the necessity of maintaining an equilibrium between moral principles and daily life resulted in constant tension and soul searching, precisely because Quaker organization and discipline served to fix the radical sectarian impulse at a particular stage. Minute points of controversy, such as the exact wording of oaths, were charged with intense emotional significance. Each generation was put to the test of divided loyalties, knowing that refusal to obey the state might result in imprisonment or confiscation of property. Again, doesn't that sound familiar? But that betrayal of principle could lead to disownment. Only constant surveillance and the systematic cultivation of charity could keep the clear springs of Quaker experience from becoming polluted. The merchant or proprietor just must show that neither wealth nor the press of business had dimmed the inner light. The reformer must prove that his schemes for human betterment in no way promoted worldly license. John Bellers, whose radical plans for penal reform were ultimately to influence Francis Place and Robert Owen, could still draw on the original missionary zeal of the fathers of Quakerism. Yet Beller's proposals were as much for social control as for liberation. Distressed by the vices of the idle poor, he envisioned highly ordered communities where industrial discipline could bring the regularity of habits essential for a life of obedience to Christ. Another Benezet, Anthony Benezet, whose life of malevolent activity did much to initiate the great age of Quaker philanthropy, could affirm that, quote, the only end for which thou wast created in this world is that by living in a state of obedience, by constant watching and prayer, thy soul may, with the assistance of divine grace, become so purified as to be fitted to dwell with God forever, end quote. Now, perfectionists who thought it possible to live in absolute conformity with the law of love would presumably refrain from slaveholding as well as from war. Quakers condemned war, and yet they recognized the power and persistence of sin. They respected the authority of government and the inviolability of private property. And they viewed labor as at once a duty and a necessary discipline. How far would they follow the Catholic and Protestant churches in reconciling conflicts between worldly interests and the transcendent standards of the gospel? Would the fellowship of the meeting and the formalized positions on war and oaths take the place of Catholic reliance on sacraments and meritorious work, or of Protestant dependence on inner grace and forensic theology, so that mundane questions like slavery would appear irrelevant to man's quest for salvation? For most sectarians, of course, slavery presented no problem, but by a remarkable coincidence the growth of the Society of Friends was closely tied to British expansion in the North Atlantic and Caribbean, and hence, either directly or indirectly, to the African slave trade. Indeed, the destiny of the Society of Friends was intertwined with American slavery in an almost providential design. In 1655, at the time of the earliest Quaker missionary work, William Penn's father captured Jamaica from Spain, and thus gave a major impetus to British sugar cultivation and the African trade. Admiral Penn was not a Quaker, but it was his fortune, coupled with an immense debt owed to him by the Duke of York, that made possible the holy experiment of Pennsylvania. Before the founding of Pennsylvania, Quaker missionaries had won many converts in Barbados, which George Rolfe called the nursery of truth, but which was also the nursery of British slavery. Among the converts were wealthy sugar planters and slaveholders, some of whom entertained George Fox during his first American visit, and a second base of American Quakerism was Rhode Island, the future capital of the North American slave trade. Inevitably, Quaker merchants in Rhode Island, the Jerseys, and Pennsylvania looked to the West Indies as their principal market. The prosperity of Quaker communities in the New World depended to a large extent on slave labor in the Caribbean. Sorry, I'm struggling tonight. Didn't realize quite how tired I was. George Fox was by no means blind to the problems raised by American slavery. In his famous letter of 1657, quote, "To friends beyond sea that have blacks and Indian slaves," he gave new force end quote. He gave new force to the traditional doctrines of Christian mercy and brotherhood. 14 years later, he preached to slaves in Barbados, and developing upon the ideal of Christian servitude, went so far as to suggest that terms of bondage be limited to 30 years. But there can be no doubt that Fox accepted Negro slavery as an institution which could be rationalized by the ancient dualisms of body and soul, matter and spirit. In his faith that the relations of master and slave could be imbued with the spirit of love, he was not in advance of many Orthodox Catholics and Protestants of earlier and later times. We should not be surprised, therefore, to learn that William Penn bought and owned Negro slaves. that a Quaker-dominated government of Pennsylvania enacted a harsh slave code, or that as late as 1730 Quaker merchants in Philadelphia were importing and selling West Indian Negroes. The Rhode Island slave trade of the 1760s involved leading Quaker families, and those who refrained from slave dealing had no scruples about dealing in rum, molasses, sugar, and rice. In England, where Quaker economic power was initially based on commerce and centered in such ports as Bristol, Liverpool, and London, connection with the African trade was inevitable. Active and powerful friends like David Barclay, Alexander Barclay, and Thomas Mildred were members of the Royal African Company. As Quaker merchant princes moved into banking, textiles, and iron, they were still tied to African markets and West Indian investments. Nor should one forget the small but important part played by Friends in developing the American South. George Fox himself organized Quaker communities in Virginia and Carolina. One of his converts, John Archdale, became Governor General of Carolina and encouraged the spread of his faith in Charlestown. During the 18th century, Quaker families moved southward from Pennsylvania into Maryland, Virginia, and South Carolina, and as successful farmers, many acquired slaves. Quaker masters have been more humane than average, but they did not Christianize the institution of slavery. It was not until 1756 that the Society of Friends took serious steps to induce owners to provide their slaves with religious instruction. Even then, Negroes were not accepted as brethren entitled to equal membership or to Quaker burial. The very exclusiveness of the society, reinforced by the rigorous obligations of membership, made it difficult to consider bondsmen as spiritual equals. Protected by this wall of separation, many Friends found it easy to exclude the problem of slavery from consciousness. A Quaker woman in Charlestown could condemn luxury, music, great wealth, and cruelty to children, and yet say nothing about the laborers in her city. Joseph Wanton, a Rhode Islander who stood on principle in his refusal to take an oath, could engage in the slave trade between 1769 and 1775, both as captain and merchant. William Dillwyn, a pupil of Anthony Benezet and future leader of the British anti-slavery movement, could write from Charlestown in 1773 discussing his success in exchanging West Indian rum for Carolina rice, and ignore the institution which made his transaction possible. But there is a mass of evidence to suggest that slaveholding provoked far more tension among Quakers than among Catholics, Anglicans, and Congregationalists. For reasons that should now be clear, the Society of Friends had a limited power to assimilate compromises with Christian ideals, and was more inclined than were the Orthodox churches to associate moral evil with institutions of the external world. Unhampered by dogmatic theology, guided by the continuing revelations of the inner light, Friends were partly immune from rationalizations which identified ancient custom with the natural law. In America, where there was opportunity to build a society consonant with emergent truth, no makeshift controls could stifle individual moral inquiry. There were, of course, economic or psychological conditions which favored the questioning of slavery. Some Quakers became concerned about the problem as a result of petty inconveniences or of fears that they would be unable to discipline Negro bond servants. Small farmers, used to a life of simplicity and hard work, could express contempt for the piety of urban merchants who sported a retinue of domestic slaves. Quaker converts such as the Nantucket carpenter Elihu Coleman who had become convinced that their relatives and former associates were blinded by false education and custom might apply the same critical spirit to the failings of their new brethren. But whatever the occasions for individual protest, it was the Quaker frame of mind that enabled men to disregard law and precedent and to judge slavery by the inner light. Let me take a sip here. William Edmondson, who accompanied George Fox to Barbados in 1671, was one of the first to move beyond the conventional faith that Christianity would soften the hearts of masters. Like many later critics of slavery, Edmondson was a man of humble origins and wide experience. He had been a carpenter's apprentice in Yorkshire, a combat veteran under Cromwell, and a Quaker missionary in Ireland. During a second visit to Barbados, when his religious instruction of slaves aroused the intense hostility of planters, he felt it necessary to assure the governor that he was interested only in saving the Negroes' souls. But in 1676, Edmondson sent out from Newport, Rhode Island, a general letter to Quakers in slaveholding colonies reflecting upon the ancient linkage between sin and bondage. He observed that Barbadian masters allowed slaves the unlawful liberty to act in accordance with their own corrupt natures, but denied them the freedom to be servants of Christ. If they were to obey the command to, quote, make their condition their own, end quote, Quakers would have to enable their Negroes to fulfill the law of Christ by suggesting that physical slavery and Christian liberty were incompatible. Edmondson inverted the traditional dualisms. Negroes were slaves to sin because they were slaves of men. From this position, it was but a short step to the conclusion that slavery itself was sin. Okay. I know that I'm not very far into it, but I am going to have to get up and move around a little bit. And I'll probably just stand up here, but give me a second to get situated. I know why I'm so tired. I did some shovel work when I got home today, and it wore my old ass out. Okay. So, let us come in here. Okay. You don't need to be looking at me like that, do you? I'll bring that up a little bit. All right. Work my legs a little bit here anyway. William Edmondson not only dissociated Negro slavery from the Christian ideal of servitude, but held that perpetual bondage was, quote, an oppression on the mind, end quote, which could not be justified by God's curse on the children of Canaan. Even if he could be shown that Africans were the descendants of Ham, had not Christ removed the, quote, wall of partition, end quote, that separated peoples? The only differences that mattered were those of sincerity and purity of faith. Ironically, the Quaker slaveholder could prove his own moral superiority and thus erect a different kind of partition by emancipating his servants, so that his, quote, self-denial may be known to all, end quote. It seems probable that men who had suffered from religious persecution were more likely to see the connection between bodily and spiritual liberty. Edmondson knew the mental and physical anguish of imprisonment. The Dutch-speaking Quakers who emigrated from Krefeld to Germantown and who signed the famous anti-slavery petition of 1688 could never forget the bloody tortures and executions of their Mennonite ancestors. Comparing the suffering of slaves with their own religious persecution, they could flatly declare that liberty of conscience should bring liberty of the body. The eyes of Europe were directed toward the Quakers' experiment in religious freedom. What would happen to the cause of truth if it were discovered that Friends profited from a form of slavery more brutal than that of the Turks or Barbary pirates. We have seen that both Catholics and Protestants were able to reconcile slavery with the Golden Rule by piously affirming that masters should treat their bondsmen as they themselves would be treated should they have the misfortune of becoming slaves. For the Germantown Quakers, enslavement was not a question of fate. The Africans had been criminally seized and shipped off to America without their consent. To purchase them was to purchase stolen goods. Because Negroes had a perfect right to liberty, they might resort to armed rebellion, which Friends could not resist without violating pacifist principles. Slaveholding then was based on sheer physical force and involved infringements of divine law, as when families were separated and adultery encouraged. The origins and consequences of Negro slavery made the institution absolutely incompatible with the Golden Rule. We should not think of Edmondson's letter and the Germantown petition as parts of continuous and progressive evolution of anti-slavery doctrine. By associating physical with spiritual liberty and consequently expanding the scope of individual moral responsibility, they brought out one of the potentialities of Quaker thought. But Edmondson's letter was without effect. The Dublin monthly meeting to which the Germantown petition was referred considered the matter too weighty for action. Philadelphia Quarterly meeting quickly passed the petition on to the yearly meeting, which quietly buried it. Unknown to Benjamin Lay and Anthony Benezet, to John Woolman and Thomas Clarkson, the Germantown protest was not rediscovered until well into the 19th century. And yet a protest had been made, a protest which forced a response from the highest official bodies of the Society of Friends. Though Quaker leaders were no more disposed to condemn slavery than had been the Spanish Council of the Indies a few years before, they could not defend their position by citing noted theologians and classical authorities. Their extreme caution and secretiveness suggest a realization that Quakers would be hard put to justify the institution. The moral vulnerability of slaveholding Friends was soon to be revealed in the hot crossfire of religious schism. George Keith arrived in East Jersey 3 years before the Germantown petition was written, having first stopped off at Barbados on his way from Europe. Like Edmondson, he had personally observed West Indian slavery, and since he had visited Quaker groups through Holland and Germany in 1677, it is possible that he knew some of the Germantown petitioners even before their migration. In general background, Keith was altogether different from such men as Fox and Edmondson. A student of philosophy, mathematics, and modern languages, he had received a Master of Arts degree at Aberdeen and had read Descartes with Gilbert Burnet. Keith's scholarship was balanced by a flaming religious zeal which in some respects anticipated the evangelical emphasis on personal choice and purity of life, which transformed Quakerism in the latter part of the 18th century. It appeared to Keith that the leading Quaker ministers and magistrates in America had lost sight of Christ the Savior, and by disregarding the imperatives of quote-unquote immediate revelation, had compromised themselves with a sinful world. Such attacks on the elite of American Quakerism brought swift retaliation. When in 1691 and 1692 Keith was disowned publicly, condemned, and even fined, he defiantly formed his own sect of Christian Quakers. Without doubting the sincerity of his opinions, we may suspect that George Keith seized upon the issue of slavery as a convenient means of embarrassing his persecutors, who included wealthy merchants and some of the powerful leaders who had suppressed the Germantown petition. After inducing his followers to sign in 1693, quote, an exhortation and caution to friends concerning buying or keeping of Negroes, end quote, Keith apparently gave no further thought to the matter. Returning to Britain, he became an Anglican convert and ultimately a missionary for the slaveholding SPG. But even if Keith embraced anti slavery as a means of exposing the inconsistency of Quakers and of proving the virtue of his own sect, the fact remains that religious schism released deep seated tensions and provided an angle of vision undistorted by traditional rationalizations. Later opponents of slavery, such as John Hepburn and Benjamin Lay, were aware of Keith's challenge. Okay. I am going to take a quick break to just move around a bit more. Standing up helps, but I am struggling tonight. So we'll give myself a couple minutes and then we'll jump back into it and try to finish. Got a ways to go, though. I don't know. I might not make it through this chapter tonight. So, anyway, quick break. We'll see. I'll be back in just a couple minutes. Okay, I feel much better now, just having gotten up and moved around, and I turned on the outside fan so it's pulling in some cooler air, and that should help a lot. So, let's jump back into it. Keith's exhortation was similar to the Germantown petition in its application to the Golden Rule and its argument that Negroes were stolen goods. The latter point was made more forceful by invoking the biblical condemnation of man stealers and by associating prisoners of war with prize goods, which the pacifist Quakers were forbidden to buy. But Keith went well beyond the Germantown petitioners in foreshadowing the major religious themes of 19th century abolitionism. His emphasis on the atonement as applying universally to all mankind was clearly an expression of his central belief in Christ the Redeemer. Christ had died not only to save souls, but to deliver the oppressed, to bring, quote, liberty both inward and outward, end quote. It was the duty of Christians to show compassion toward anyone in misery. The choice between keeping or manumitting a slave was a test of true virtue. Since the guilt of man-stealing carried over to the buyers of slaves, masters must expect the full wrath of God's judgment if they failed to repent and reform. They must sacrifice their riches, come out of Babylon, and not be partakers of her sins. But though the salvation of slave owners depended on an immediate repentance and decision to act, Keith recognized that it would be impossible to liberate all slaves at once. Bondsmen must be prepared for freedom by Christian education. It was only reasonable that they should pay for their maintenance by a limited period of moderate service. By combining expediency with an absolute condemnation of the very principle of slavery, Keith announced the central doctrines of future abolitionism. One should note that he arrived at this position after a search for religious truth which led him through painful conflicts with his brethren, and that his views on slavery were, in a sense, an externalization of his religious beliefs. For more than a generation after Keith's exhortation, no Quaker wrote on the issue with such uncompromising boldness. Yet a few isolated individuals came to see the slave system as a threat to religious purity and bore testimony against it in meeting or in unauthorized preaching and writing. Robert Pyle, a well-to-do farmer and proponent citizen of Chester County, gives us a rare insight into the deep tensions that might lead to a conviction that slavery was sinful. Having experienced great difficulty in retaining English servants, Pyle felt a strong motion within himself to purchase a Negro, apparently a woman with small children. Then he dreamed that he and a friend were walking down a road. They came upon a black pot which was lying by the roadside. When Pyle picked it up, his friend wanted part of it. Pyle refused to surrender the pot, but soon came to an enormous ladder, which, he tells us 3 times, was standing exact upright. The ladder led, of course, to heaven, and Pyle realized that he would have to climb it with the black pot in his hand. He soon discovered, however, that it was hard enough work to climb the ladder with both hands, and that he would have to leave the pot at the base of the ladder. Upon awaking, he instantly grasped the religious, if not the Freudian, symbolism of this remarkable dream, and decided, quote, to let black Negroes or pots alone, end quote. Moreover, he concluded that if slavery were unlawful in quote unquote this gospel time, it would be expedient for Quaker monthly meetings to encourage manumissions by judging whether owners could bear the financial loss and whether slaves were prepared for freedom. Evidently, a Negro's right to liberty would depend on his piety and willingness to obey God. During the early 18th century, a number of Quaker meetings in America were stirred by anti-slavery agitation, but we know the names of only a few of the more outspoken abolitionists. William Southby, who had quarreled publicly with George Keith, helped to promote in 1698 an official letter to Barbadian friends requesting them to end shipments of Negroes to Pennsylvania. Some years later, Southby's persistent attacks on slavery apparently resulted in his disownment. And I assume disownment is sort of like, um, what is it that the Catholics call it? Um, excommunication. William Burling provoked a flurry of debate in Long Island until he was silenced by the Quakers' subtle disciplinary machinery. More intractable was John Farmer, an Englishman who denounced slavery in Nantucket and then defied the warnings and remonstrations of the Rhode Island Yearly Meeting. Disowned in New England, Farmer moved on to Philadelphia, where, though he met with a chilly reception, he continued his lonely crusade. While conservative friends were generally successful in quieting or isolating anti-slavery agitators, a questioning spirit developed in a number of local meetings, such as Flushing, Long Island, Dartmouth, Massachusetts, and Chester, Pennsylvania. Even the cautious merchants who dominated Philadelphia Yearly Meeting found it impossible to ignore the sentiments of vocal friends who were, quote, straightened in their minds, end quote, against holding slaves. A number of circumstances contributed to a guarded shift from the official policy of inaction. In the late 1690s, with the prospect of a vastly enlarged African trade, men might well wonder, on purely economic grounds, whether an influx of Negroes would be advantageous to Pennsylvania. There is evidence that many independent farmers and artisans, regardless of their views on the morality of slaveholding, were opposed to heavy importations of Negro laborers. In addition, the same racial prejudice and fear of insurrection, which were expressed in acts, quote, for the better regulating of Negroes, end quote, could strengthen the desire to limit or prohibit the inflow of slaves. As we have seen, such motives contributed in the early 18th century to restrictive laws in a number of colonies, and despite the inclination of many Quakers to justify the simple ownership of Negroes, the institution would obviously be more palatable if it were further removed from the wars of Africa and the violence of the slave ship. As Philadelphia attracted an increased number of non-Quaker merchants who had no scruples about profiting from war or prize goods, the distinction between slavery and the slave trade acquired still greater significance. Men who were threatening the Quakers' economic and political dominance and who were outside the reach of religious controls could at least be scorned as the importers of human flesh. It would be a triumph of power as well as of morality if Quakers succeeded in persuading their own people to avoid the trade and then exerted influence to secure its legal prohibition. As early as 1696, Philadelphia Yearly Meeting defined the broad principles that would govern official policy for more than half a century. Owners were charged with the moral welfare of their bondsmen, but were tacitly assured that their property rights did not conflict with religious purity. To purchase slaves for private use was permissible, but friends were cautioned against trading in Negroes as a business or being involved in their further importation. Since even this compromising position carried no sanctions, there was considerable room for further steps which would not menace the profits or security of slaveholders. Many prominent Quakers were willing to encourage the Pennsylvania Assembly to restrict or prohibit the importation of Negroes. Knowing the opposition of the Privy Council to such measures, they realized that their best hope lay in enlisting the aid of powerful British friends, who might bring pressure on the central government. Over the strenuous protests of William Southby, who thought that a moral decision required no outside support, Philadelphia Yearly Meeting appealed in 1712 to London Yearly Meeting, observing that some friends had been morally troubled by slavery and that previous efforts had failed to block an influx of Negroes into Pennsylvania. The timing of this message was inopportune, for Britain was about to secure the coveted asiento. London Yearly Meeting was influenced by conservative mercantile thought and was rendered still more cautious by its campaign for greater religious toleration in a period of rising high church sentiment. London Friends not only dismissed the question as being too weighty for an immediate decision, but rebuked Philadelphia for writing about without first consulting the other groups of American Quakers. In this reply and in later epistles, London Yearly Meeting strongly disapproved of Quakers engaging in the African slave trade, but as Sidney James has written, quote, the crisis had arrived and the Quakers had not been able to cope with it. Instead of decision, there had been paralysis in the highest institutions of the church, end quote. In some respects, the Quaker psychology was remarkably similar to that which later characterized many Americans. Lacking the guidance of established tradition or philosophic doctrine, Friends devised subtle mechanisms for creating and assessing group consensus. One congregation could not take a position far in advance of the others, as was discovered by the Germantown petitioners and by Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, when it appealed to London. Quote, religious truth might grow, says Sidney James, but not in different directions, end quote. When Quakers in Newport asked their monthly meeting in 1715 whether it was quote-unquote agreeable to truth to brand a slave on the cheek, they were told that it was not. But when doubts arose regarding the lawfulness of perpetual bondage in Dartmouth, Massachusetts, where a Quaker woman had been temporarily disowned for beating her slave to death, the question was finally evaded. Men like Southby, who had in 1712 openly petitioned the Pennsylvania Assembly for the abolition of slavery, were clearly threatening a religious unity which depended upon a finely tuned sensitivity and an unquestioning response to the norms of the group. In the most admired and influential Friends were accepted, and if the most admired and influential Friends ever accepted anti-slavery as a test of religious purity, their opinions would spread with rapidity and would be backed by the most powerful forces of conformity. But in the meantime, dissenters risked the danger of appearing, as it were, un-Quaker. Philadelphia Yearly Meeting continued to affirm and even to strengthen its policy in 1696. Encouraged by London's growing disapproval of the African trade, it advised Friends in 1730 not to buy Negroes imported by others. Yet in 1715, Philadelphia had warned Chester Quarterly Meeting against judging brethren who happened to own slaves. A few years later, the most outspoken rebels had been silenced, and the Society of Friends entered a period of uneasy compromise. But as the United States was to learn in future years, no compromise could conceal the fact that disturbing questions had been raised. Sorry, I had a note marked back there for something to look up, and it fell. Okay, we have about 15 pages to go. A period of 18 years intervened between the publication of John Hepburn's The American Defense of the Christian Golden Rule in 1715 and Elihu Coleman's A Testament Against that Anti-Christian Practice of Making Slaves of Men, which was the first attack on slavery to receive official approval from a Quaker meeting. The two pamphlets are, however, strikingly similar in tone and approach. They gave the impression of having been written by temperate-minded mechanics, whose independent reading and serious reflection made up for lack of formal education. Both men were obviously devout Quakers, but they had assimilated to some degree the ideas and mood of the early Enlightenment, whereas Edmondson had seen slavery as an obstacle to conversion and the exercise of Christian liberty, and Keith had emphasized the liberating effect of the atonement. Hepburn and Coleman virtually ignored the implications of original sin. They built their cases on the argument that man was created with a free will, with a capacity to choose the good and even to conform to the attributes of God. And since moral perfectibility was the proper end of man and could be achieved only through freedom of choice, even the most beneficent slavery was a, quote, manifest robbery of that noble gift, end quote. Coleman explicitly maintained that bondage was contrary to nature as well as to Scripture. There is no hint that either writer questioned the dogmas of revealed religion, yet the issue of slavery provided a framework for developing secular moral arguments and for applying the critical method to Scripture. In 1676, Edmondson had felt it necessary to attack the assumption that Negro slavery was a fulfillment of the curse of Canaan. The great attention Coleman devoted to this question may have indicated an increasing tendency of Americans to identify Negroes with the children of Ham, but it also showed the writer's willingness to examine biblical texts in the light of reason and human standards of justice. For Coleman, who said that he himself would not be guilty of slaveholding for all the riches and glory in the world, it was inconceivable that the divine goodness had condemned a class of men to perpetual misery. Deists and skeptics took a similar view of original sin and reprobation. Rational analysis was particularly evident in two articles which Hepburn added to his text. The first, quote, Arguments Against Making Slaves of Men, end quote, was written by an American, probably a Quaker, in 1713. The second was taken indirectly from the Athenian Oracle of London, a few pages of which had been reprinted in Boston in 1705. Taken together, these remarkable essays answered virtually every pro-slavery argument that would appear during the next century and a half. By 1713, it had already been said that the slave trade encouraged wars and crime in Africa, that enslavement was not the necessary consequence of sparing a captive's life, that it was unlawful to punish without a reason, or to profit from labor without recompense, and that bondage defaced the image of God, that it compelled men to act in ways that brought cruel punishment, that it led to the separation of families, to adultery, and to the violation of all the commandments. Both writers took special pains to discredit the significantly secure argument that Negroes were far happier as American slaves than as African savages, and the American author anticipated the warning dramatized by Hinton Rowan Helper in 1857 that Negro bondage would lead to a growing divergence and conflict between rich slaveholders and poor whites. Yet even in 1713, an anti-slavery writer could affirm an axiom later accepted by Thomas Jefferson and countless other Americans. It was unthinkable that Negroes and whites should live together in freedom. His proposed solution was essentially that the later colonizationists, before being emancipated, Negroes should be given a Christian education. Then subscriptions should be raised to send all manumitted slaves back to Africa, where they could further the cause of religion and civilization. A taste for irony and satire was as much a part of the enlightened mind as was an enthusiasm for social planning. To those who maintained that the Negro's ignorance and wickedness were sufficient reason for his enslavement, Coleman replied that the spirit of a born philosophe, quote, if the plea would do, I do believe they need not go so far for slaves as now they do, end quote. Both Hepburn and Coleman compared Turks with Christians, to the latter's disadvantage, and Hepburn even adopted the mode of what Paul Hazard calls, quote, the ubiquitous critic, end quote, who sought a new objectivity by viewing the follies of his society through the eyes of a Persian or Chinese traveler. In Hepburn's rather clumsily contrived dialogue, a Turk exposes the inconsistencies of an American slave owner when it begins to appear that Islam is at least free from the hypocrisy of Christianity. An apologist arrives who tries to show that the slaveholder is not a true Christian, but the slaveholder dryly observes that the English bishops have accepted the ownership of slaves. The houses of SPG missionaries are, quote, crawling black with them, end quote. Presbyterians who claim to be zealous followers of the Reformation engage actively in the enslavement of Africans. The Baptists, for all their piety and reputed simplicity of life, lovingly embrace slavery. The American master includes with some glee, quote, now if the church and Presbyterians and Baptists did but agree so lovingly in other points as they do in making slaves of Negroes, I think they might be styled one community, end quote. The apologist replies somewhat lamely to this point and suggests that only pacifists can be consistent Christians. When the master maintains that no group is more forward in making slaves than the Quakers, the Christian can only answer that it is the greatest wonder to see such a people embracing and enriching sin. Okay. For Hepburn and Coleman, as indeed for the philosophes, the ultimate problem was now how evil had become entrenched as custom and accepted as universal practice. Since Quakers could assume that other churches still lived in the shadow of apostasy, the question narrowed to an explanation of their own sect's impurity. The Old Testament gave examples of a chosen people suffering for the cause of truth, and then in time of ease becoming forgetful of their mission. Friends had once been subjected to the bitterest hardships. Now wives painted their faces, powdered their hair, and adorned themselves with ruffles, ribbons, and lace. These luxuries and the idleness of Quaker children were made possible by Negro slavery. It was not friends, but the servants of friends who lived like dogs and walked barefoot in the snow. Hepburn and Coleman were confident that George Fox and the Quaker fathers had opposed slavery. Always a few conscientious men had remained pure and had even spoken out against the creeping pollution. But the change had come almost imperceptibly. The slaveholders had succeeded in expressing anti-slavery writings, suppressing anti-slavery writings, until, according to Hepburn, copies were as scarce as a phoenix egg. Hepburn confessed that he himself had brooded in silence for 30 years and hoped he would be forgiven. The effects of lost innocence could now be seen in the Quakers' involvement in political affairs and in their cowardly acceptance of wartime taxes. What was needed perhaps was a new era of persecution which would awaken friends to their senses, for Negro slavery was a symbol of the Quakers' own spiritual bondage, which blocked the way to restoration and redemption. These later themes were developed far more stridently by Ralph Sandiford and Benjamin Lay, neither of whom betrayed the slightest awareness of living in the age of enlightenment. Unlike Hepburn and Coleman, these men made abolitionism the core of their religion and the center of their existence. Both were ready to be ostracized or even to die for the cause, and their works drip with blood and smell of the smoke and ash of hell. Sandiford was born in Liverpool in 1693, the year of Keith's exhortation, and was converted to Quakerism early in life. There is a chiliastic note in his writing that suggests a certain affinity with the radical reformers of the English civil wars. He could not conceal his sympathy for the soldiers who, prior to their conversion to Quakerism, had been willing to fight to liberate men from the oppression of priests, physicians, and lawyers. Perceiving the world in the lurid colors of the book of Revelation, Sandiford was prepared to find evil in high places and in the most hallowed traditions. He was enough of a biblicist to say that he himself would, quote, lay out his interest, end quote, in the slave trade if it had been ordained by God. He had not learned, however, that Christ's atonement, quote, should allow should allow his followers in the most arbitrary and tyrannical oppression that hell has invented on this globe, end quote. Therefore, when Sandiford was employed for a while by a planter in South Carolina after being shipwrecked and marooned in the Bahamas, he was afflicted by the thought of his own involvement in sin. He tried to escape the taint of evil by refusing to share his employer's riches. Sandiford was noted for his extreme simplicity of life, but he apparently prospered as a Philadelphia merchant. Because his shop looked out upon a market where slaves were auctioned, he was burdened night and day by the thought that Christians of his own sect saw no harm in selling men like beasts. He carried his concern to Philadelphia yearly meeting, where his accusations aroused a storm of controversy. In 1729, he persuaded Benjamin Franklin to print a brief examination of the practice of the times, a work which brought him persecution and disownment. Ill and at bay, he retired to the country and died in 1733 at the age of 40. Possibly he received some solace from the visits of a little hunchbacked sailor and merchant named Benjamin Lay. If Benjamin Lay was not quite sane, one should remember that the sanest minds found excuses for Negro slavery. In an earlier age, Lay might have founded a religious sect. He dreamed of a millennium when men might unite in loving fellowship, when the entire earth would become a new Eden, cleansed of sin, deformity, and ugliness. But he knew from bitter experience that the world was full of hatred and persecution. He struck back by denouncing the unrighteous and by seizing opportunities to assert his own moral freedom. Benjamin Lay had long been a troublemaker and a man in search of a cause. It was quite by accident that he came to see Negro slavery as the epitome of sin. He was born in 1681 and a half in Colchester, England. His parents were poor Quakers who bound out the deformed lad to a glove maker. By 1710 he had become a sailor. On a voyage to Turkey, he learned of the relative mildness of the Moslem slavery. He also listened in disgust to the boastful stories of some of his shipmates, who, loosened by alcohol, described scenes of lust and cruelty in the African slave trade. But Lay could not have been much concerned over the question, for he had no qualms about moving later in life to Barbados. After his experiences at sea, he returned to England, married a hunchbacked woman named Sarah, and settled down as a glove maker and draper. His mind, however, could never be settled, and he soon developed an obsession that provided an outlet for his smoldering discontent. It appeared to Lay that the Society of Friends had been corrupted by the practice of allowing ministers to speak when they had not been directly prompted by God. This was simply an extreme application of the views of George Fox, but when Lay incited public disturbances in a number of meetings, he was summarily disowned. Undaunted, the reformer began disrupting the services of Baptists and Presbyterians, and even secured private audience with George II, to whom he presented Milton's tract on removing hirelings from the church. He continued to attend the Quaker meeting at Colchester, sometimes offering apologies and asking forgiveness. When he finally decided to emigrate to America, the Colchester monthly meeting, obviously grateful for good riddance, gave him a membership certificate to present at Philadelphia. but after being censured by the quarterly meeting for unfaithfulness to the Philadelphians, Colchester meeting then sent a full report to America, which warned that Lay had been disowned for contentious conduct and that he had continued to cause trouble up to the time he left England. We cannot be certain when Benjamin and Sarah Lay lived in Barbados, but it was probably soon before they arrived in Philadelphia in 1731. Because they ran a store and sold food, they were made acutely aware of the near famine of neighboring slaves. Negroes rushed for the garbage that Sarah threw into the street, although it was too rotten for the dogs to touch. On market days, when the slaves crowded into the shop, Sarah would sometimes give them decayed fish or cockroach-infested biscuits, but even this could not prevent the Negroes from stealing food. Benjamin became seasoned enough to the ways of Barbados to whip those thieves he caught. He felt remorse, however, and worried over the corrupting influence of a slave society. This fear became overwhelming when Sarah saw a naked slave hanging in front of a Quaker's house, a pool of blood under his feet. The Quaker master explained that the ungrateful creature had been punished for running away, but the Lays decided that they themselves must escape from Barbados. When they arrived in Philadelphia and discovered that even there the evil had taken root, it was only natural that Benjamin should find in Ralph Sandiford a kindred spirit. Thomas Clarkson, who must have received his information from American Quakers, admitted that Lay had been an eccentric who, quote, was apt to go out of due bounds, end quote. J.F. Watson called him, quote, the singular Pythagorean, cynical Christian philosopher, end quote. Perhaps Lay is best thought of as the Quaker Diogenes. Like Diogenes, he was remembered by legends of his spectacular nonconformity. When a man routinely referred to himself as Lay's humble servant, Benjamin was supposed to have snapped back, quote, if thou art my humble servant, clean my shoes, end quote. No doubt his shoes were dirty, for he refused to travel by horse or any vehicle. He wore clothes of his own making to avoid materials produced by slave labor or by the killing of animals. He was a strict vegetarian and once put on a public exhibition of smashing a set of Sarah's teacups in order to discourage the use of sugar, which Lay said was mixed with the chopped up limbs, bowels, and excrement of poor slaves. According to one account, the crowd succeeded in rescuing and running off with much of Sarah's china. His demonstrative protests against slavery were much in the style of a cynic philosopher or radical perfectionist. He went to a Quaker meeting clothed in sackcloth and denounced the wealthy slave masters. In winter, he sat outside a meeting house, one leg and foot bare in the snow, and when people expressed concern for his health, he asked them why they were blind to the sufferings of their scantily clad Negroes. When ejected from a meeting house, he lay in front of the door in the rain and made the congregation step over his body. He supposedly kidnapped the child of a slave owner in order to show the father, if only for a few hours, how it felt to have a child taken away. His most famous exploit occurred at the Quaker meeting in Burlington. To dramatize the coercive basis of slavery, Lay put on a military uniform, complete with sword, which he disguised under the conventional Quaker cloak. Then he enclosed a bladder filled with pokeberry juice within the empty covers of a folio volume, which presumably represented the Bible. After rising in meeting to castigate the slave owners, he finally told his enemies that they might as well throw off the plain coat of Quakerism as he himself now did, standing forth in the dress of war. Men who forcibly held their brothers in bondage, he cried, would be no less justified in the eyes of God if they plunged a sword into the hearts of their slaves. At this point, Lay thrust the sword into his Bible and the red juice gushed out, spattering the horrified friends who sat nearby. After Sarah's death in 1735, Benjamin Lay became increasingly isolated. Cut off from all religious fellowship, he lived in a cave-like dwelling in the country, cultivating his garden and writing tracts against slavery, alcohol, and capital punishment. Lay admitted that Ralph Sandiford had become mentally deranged, and there can be no doubt that the little hunchback suffered from a similar malady. The patient reader of All Slave Keepers Apostates can well believe the story that the original manuscript was completely lacking in order or pagination, and that when Benjamin Franklin pointed this out to the author, he was told that he could print the pages in any order he chose. The significant point, however, is not that Lay and Sandiford became alienated and unbalanced, but that anti-slavery served as an outlet for deviant personalities. The writings of Lay and Sandiford are charged with feelings of anguish and persecution. They preach the necessity of moral purification and the inevitability of divine judgment. Both men expressed a longing for love and fellowship, and occasionally fell into despair over their own unworthiness. Lay especially, who called himself, quote, a poor common sailor and an illiterate man, end quote, said he felt mean and contemptible in the sight of other men. But this tension between the desire to be and belong and a crushing sense of self-hatred could be resolved by marching to Armageddon with the forces of the Lord. The founders of Quakerism had not put love of unity above devotion to truth. Modeling themselves on Isaiah and Jeremiah, the anti-slavery prophets knew that the devil could not be intimidated by sweet language. To speak the truth would, of course, bring a furious backlash from the powers of darkness. Satan's conspirators threatened Lay with the stocks and removed him bodily from Quaker meetings. They were responsible, he thought, for the Sandiford's insanity and early death. They had even plotted to separate Benjamin from his wife Sarah, and after bringing on her death, had sought to shift the blame to her husband. But the anti-slavery martyrs took courage in the thought that they stood with such men of the past as Fox and Keith, and were supported by a hidden Quaker Illuminati in Nantucket, Long Island, and Jersey. While Lay and Sandiford could draw on personal experience with plantation slavery, they devoted remarkably little attention to the Negro. Their long digressions on seemingly extraneous subjects are puzzling until one grasps the fact that anti-slavery was a vehicle for attacking a multitude of evils. It provided a way of exposing the hypocrisy of a fallen ministry which performed the devil's work by making preaching a trade and an instrument of compromise. It was a medium of moral purification, since slavery had long been associated with luxury, idleness, and sexual immorality, as well as with social discipline. In their diatribes against whoredom, divorce, and lazy women, the two writers seemed to lose all sight of their central subject. But slavery for them was not simply one of various unrelated evils, but the source of all iniquity. Indeed, the validity of religious truth and of man's ability to know right from wrong depended upon a perception of slavery as sin. Deism or atheism were the only alternatives to a religion based on anti-slavery. As Sandiford put it, quote, if this is not an evil, there is no evil in the world, but that tradition and custom make such, end quote. According to Lay, an acceptance of slavery invalidated all religious activities, for slavery had come to symbolize not only sin and death, but every violation of the Christian ideal of love and brotherhood. It was a concrete model of selfishness, greed, and man's cruelty to man. All the tyranny and corruption that perfectionists like Thomas Müntzer had seen in the social order, men like Lay and Sandiford saw in Negro slavery. real quick. I think we're down 6 pages to go, including the one we're on. And anti-slavery gave an order and pattern to history as well as to moral experience. Sandiford posed the central question, quote, "And has not the Lord by his extraordinary providence opened this America before the Europeans and given us peace and plenty among the natives? And shall we go to Africa for bread and lay the burden which appertains to our bodily support on their shoulders?" End quote. The Quakers had arrived in the New World, according to Lay, as, quote, "poor, vile, miserable wretches, destitute and forlorn," end quote. As long as they had been disciplined by hard work, they had lived with a sense of their, quote, "filthy, abominable, undone, and woeful cursed condition," end quote. Because of their piety and humility they had prospered, and for a time had been true to their great mission. But blinded by custom and convenience, they had allowed Negro slavery to seep in like a black poison. Their fall from virtue gave a new meaning to biblical prophecy. If Negroes were not the descendants of Cain, their bondage was most certainly the fruit of Cain's rebellion. American slavery was the Antichrist and the seven-headed dragon of Revelation. The Lord was whetting his glittering sword, and his vengeance was certain unless the new children of Israel separated themselves from the filthiness of the heathen and came away from Babylon. In America, where the millennium had seemed so imminent, and where Satan had committed his forces, God would show no mercy to the betrayers of righteousness. In the mid-19th century, a few radical Quakers, such as William Edward Forster, came to see the mass poverty of Ireland and the English cities as a national sin. Unless the entire social system was transformed, Forster said, the guilt would fall on everyone. This critical vision, while no doubt an authentic outgrowth of the Quaker social conscience, was a far cry from the society's traditional acceptance of economic inequalities. It was one thing to preserve the original testimonies against war, oaths, or using such words as "you" and "February." It was quite another to risk upsetting the Founding Fathers' delicate equilibrium between conscience and authority, individualism and conformity. And yet the living faith of the Fathers could not be perpetuated by mere words and formalized acts. Like Americans in the age of Jackson, 18th century Quakers assumed that the central turning point of history had come in the recent past, such as the American Revolution had culminated a century of enlightenment. George Fox had fulfilled the promise of the Reformation. The task of Friends as a chosen people was to maintain the purity of a discovered truth by re-experiencing it in their daily lives. But as Quakers lost their status as rebellious outlaws and acquired relative security, it became increasingly difficult to re-experience with any conviction the selfless courage of the Fathers. The fear of declining zeal and corruption from the outside world might have been overcome by an extended attack on the existing social order, but the Quaker mind, as we have seen, had been thoroughly immunized against the virus of radical Anabaptism. The social protest of a William Forster would require a long development of reform consciousness. In the early 18th century, Quakers began developing new means of combating the sins of pride, sloth, and sensuality. Because they conceived the world as a testing ground and man's life as a continuing quest for truth, they were free from the prejudices which assigned a higher virtue to the nobler or more refined occupations. The important question was whether a man was honest and diligent in his calling, not whether he was prince or a carpenter. Barred in England from the professions and government, Quakers rapidly acquired a reputation as shrewd and incredibly successful businessmen. On both sides of the Atlantic, Friends prospered as merchants, bankers, and manufacturers. But while hard work was associated with mental discipline and sobriety of temper, wealth itself brought spasms of anxiety. Precepts regarding diligence and concentration were coupled with the gravest warnings. Economic activity was perhaps an aid to religious purity, but wealth could be a sign of decay. The softening influence of wealth was offset in part by a tightening of organization and discipline. By the second quarter of the 18th century, Quaker leaders were much alarmed by the threat of worldliness, religious apathy, immorality, and even deism. In time of war, they were particularly concerned over a laxness in discipline which led many Friends to compromise traditional standards. In response to these pressures, Quaker meetings became increasingly specialized in function. Elders and local groups of overseers acquired wider powers. Through regular correspondence and traveling missionaries, closer communications were established among the various meetings in America and between America and Great Britain. In addition to providing regular channels for the exchange of information and opinion, the communications network enabled Friends to enlarge and institutionalize charitable activities. The developing patterns of mutual aid, which extended across the Atlantic, would have a profound relevance for the future anti-slavery movement. 3.5 pages. Moreover, by the mid-18th century, the Quaker International had devised effective mechanisms for political action. Originally designed to aid Quaker victims of persecution, the London Meeting for Sufferings had developed into an executive committee dealing with important questions between yearly meetings. Long accustomed to the need for lobbying against discriminatory laws in England, the Meeting for Sufferings became increasingly preoccupied with colonial laws which infringed upon the interests of American Friends. By mid-century, the meeting had appointed a parliamentary agent and a standing subcommittee for parliamentary and colonial affairs. Knowledge of American affairs was kept up to date by the presence in London of Quaker colonial correspondents. The rise of the Society of Friends as an international pressure group was paralleled by the Quakers' growing sense of separate identity. Rules against marriage with outsiders, a new emphasis on wearing distinctive dress, and the inauguration in 1737 of birthright membership served to insulate Friends from the corruptions of the world. Like a black skin, the peculiar garb and speech marked Quakers as a people apart. Yet their survival would depend in large measure on their ability to transcend symbols of separateness and establish fruitful contacts with the children of the world. Along with economic and organizational activities came a growing spirit of otherworldliness, a renewed conviction of man's depravity and utter dependence on the will of God. This movement may have been influenced by the writings of European quietists, and it was probably in part a reaction against rationalism and religious uncertainty. In any event, when Quakers came to meet an overpowering sense of many Quakers came to feel an overpowering sense of guilt which would be overcome only by self-crucifixion and by what John Woolman called daily dying. By dissociating oneself from the distractions of the world, it was possible to concentrate one's life in the series of expectations and fulfillments, in which the soul would be purified by the inner movings of the Spirit. This orientation would lead to obsessive introspection and withdrawal, and yet Quakers had long been conditioned to seek the social correlatives of inward purity, and moral exercises of the ideal Christian could be seen only in his way of life. Religious truth, which could not be discovered by rational analysis, might best be known by observing and imitating the actions of obvious saints. Whether a man is considered a saint or a troublemaking eccentric depends largely on circumstance. Down to the mid-18th century, Quaker abolitionists were isolated and forced into extreme position. There were no channels through which they could exert a positive influence on Quaker leaders or receive moderating pressures from a receptive audience. It was otherwise with John Woolman and Anthony Benezet, who were instrumental in convincing the Society of Friends that anti-slavery was a test of religious truth. Since the activities of Woolman and Benezet were closely connected with the rise of anti-slavery movements in Britain and America, we shall not discuss them here. The important point is that by the mid-18th century, Quakerism provided a cultural setting in which hostility to slavery could become something more than individual dissent. But while Quakerism furnished a complex set of conditions which made an anti-slavery movement possible, it was essential that there be some triggering force to set off a cumulative reaction. Despite continuing advice from the various yearly meetings against buying or selling slaves, there is little evidence of a gradual evolution toward abolitionism. The change was sudden when it came. In 1757, London Yearly Meeting became alarmed over the involvement of Friends in the slave trade. In the same year, the London Meeting for Sufferings appointed a committee to investigate the problem. The next year saw Philadelphia Yearly Meeting alter its traditional policy. Henceforth, all members who bought or sold Negroes were to be excluded from business meetings or from making financial contributions to the society. In 1760, New England Quakers made the importation of slaves an offense subject to discipline. This flurry of legislation culminated in 1761 when London Yearly Meeting announced that slave dealers merited disownment. It is clear that this sudden stiffening of official policy was a direct response to a crisis brought on by the 7 Years' War. There were a number of reasons why the war strained the Quaker conscience. The British and colonial governments, recognizing the grim seriousness of the conflict, were understandably impatient over the Quakers' refusal to fight or pay taxes, both in England and America. Friends endured the unpleasant experience of being branded as traitors and fanatics. The era of persecution which John Hepburn almost hoped for had arrived. A strengthening of in-group discipline was accompanied by despair, by yearnings for withdrawal from evil, and by millennial prophecies. The crisis was most acute in Pennsylvania, where the presence of Friends in the colonial government forced a decision on the compatibility of politics and morality. For the Quaker members of the Assembly, there could be no middle ground between compromise and withdrawal. To remain in office and to obstruct the war effort would be disastrous for the Quakers' reputation and might conceivably prevent a victory which even pacifists could consider essential. Subjected to heavy pressure from English friends who feared retaliatory measures from their own government, the Pennsylvanians resigned from office and surrendered their original idea of a holy experiment. This decision for withdrawal and self-purification led to a significant linkage of ideas. Quakers who continued to hold public office were subject to the same disciplinary rules as slaveholders. In addition, the frontier warfare seemed to annihilate the Quakers' traditional hopes for a just Indian policy. In many respects, the Indian problem had paralleled that of slavery. The Quaker demand that settlers prove a just title to land purchased from the Indians could be related to questions regarding the legitimacy of slave property. The view that Indian raids were prima facie evidence of injustice was similar to the argument that the coercion required by slavery was proof of the institution's unlawfulness. When hostilities broke out in 1755 on the Pennsylvania frontier and were interpreted as deserved retribution for generations of injustice, the lesson had obvious relevance for the holders of slaves. The point was pressed home by a special committee appointed by Philadelphia Yearly Meeting in 1758 to visit neighboring slave owners. The very forces that led to the disengagement from politics intensified a sense of obligation to other victims of hatred and persecution. It was then in time of severe crisis that the Society of Friends took the first significant steps of commitment to anti-slavery principles. In a period of intense soul-searching, of desire for self-purification, and of concern over their image in the eyes of others, a decision to refrain from dealing in slaves was a means of reasserting the perfectionist content of their faith. It was a way of prescribing a form of selfish economic activity without repudiating the pursuit of wealth, a way of tightening discipline and organization without severing all ties with outsiders, a way of affirming the individual's moral will and the historic mission of the church without challenging the basic structure of the social order. We made it. That's the end of that chapter. That takes us into chapter 11, Religious Sources of Anti-Slavery Thought, the man of feeling in the best of worlds. And that I will pick up on probably Tuesday, because Sunday I'll be having my bi-monthly, bi-weekly, whatever you want to call it, meeting that usually tends to run pretty late, so I may not do my reading that night. So our next chapter is 31 pages, so it's about the same as what we just read tonight, which was not an overly long chapter. I'm just really tired tonight. Wore myself out swinging a mattock. So anyway, that'll be it for tonight. I am not going to game because too much. So I will just end it here, and I will see you in the next stream, which will be tomorrow night, which is just a gaming stream. No reading on Saturdays. So I will see you then.